Hi, welcome to the latest episode of History You Didn't Know But Should. I'm Ray.
And I'm Chris.
And today we're going to be looking at a little thing in American history called the Truman Doctrine. And Chris, this is one of those, uh, I guess, events in American history or concepts that arise in American history that it just has so many tentacles going from the 1940s to our day that it just, the more I look into it, the more amazed I am at how many things that America's doing in the 21st century that you can directly or indirectly relate all the way back to the 1940s.
Yeah, I think one of the things that we have to recognize is that America is a global powerhouse, if you will, and that we have the responsibility to ensure the freedoms of American citizens that are here. But the United States, from its inception, has been uh, willing or felt the need to bring those same freedoms of democracy to other countries, especially those countries that maybe feel that they are being threatened from the inside by authoritarian regimes or by dictatorial regimes. And so, coming into the Truman Doctrine, it is an American foreign policy that basically originates with the goal of ensuring that democracy will be forever part of world influence. And it is something, as you mentioned, that not only is it a foreign policy that was kind of directed by Harry Truman, but it is one that is still in play today. And I think even more so in the context of looking at the Israel-Palestinian war that is currently going on, I think we can see some of the aspects of the Truman Doctrine playing into that. Also, the Russia-Ukraine crisis. That's another example
Oh,
where
yeah.
you'll see what we're talking about today kind of play into right now.
Yeah, we have this. I think it was George W. Bush. When it wasn't George W. Bush sort of echoed it, but you heard it. Was it Woodrow Wilson during World War One? Make the world safe for democracy type of thing. It's the idea that America needs to some degree, be the world's police. So we're going back let's go back here to 1944, 1945, 1947. President Franklin Delano Roosevelt wins a fourth term, right? He dies he's inaugurated in January 20, 1945. I'll get it right. And he dies a few months later. And then Harry Truman becomes president. And Harry Truman is one of these guys. He's just fascinating to me. I love to go and watch videos of him and interviews he gave. A lot of times post presidency, he's just a plain spoken guy. That's not just something people say about him from a historical point of view or political point of view. He was just a very, you know, plain spoken guy. I imagine in private in the White House, he probably had a lot of salty language going on.
Right. Yeah, he was just a common, you're right, common guy who just he said what he felt. And but I also think that you talk about saltiness, and I think some of that saltiness kind of comes from kind of the position he was put in as vice president. As vice president, he really was not given any insight into what was going on in the White House. While he was the vice president for Franklin Roosevelt, Roosevelt really didn't involve him. And so I think there was some saltiness there. Once again, we could put that into kind of context in the recent president, vice president. I mean, Biden and Harris. There seems to be a little saltiness that's there as well, and
Yep.
it just shows the importance because you are one heartbeat away as a vice president from being the president of the United States. We saw that with Truman. As you mentioned, when Roosevelt dies, Truman doesn't just become president of the United States. Truman becomes president of the United States during a major war with a decision that weighs heavily upon him and also on the world as far as what he does to end the war. So I do think he is salty, but he also understands the importance of America and what America should do when it comes to foreign policy.
Yeah, and I think he wanted to see America play a much more important role on the global stage. So, you're talking about Hiroshima. and Nagasaki, the dropping of the atomic bombs there. But in March of 1947, he goes to Congress. Okay, and this is where we sort of get into the idea of the Truman Doctrine, and he gives a speech, and this speech was basically discussing an issue with Greece, where you had two sides. You had the Greek government fighting the Greek communist, right? And Great Britain had announced that it was no longer going to provide support, military, economic, or otherwise, to the Greeks in their fight against the Greek Communist Party. And there was also another issue with Turkey. And what you're seeing post World War II is the Soviet Union, refusing to withdraw its troops out of Iran, trying to seek oil concessions from Iran, putting pressure on Turkey. So the United States, specifically here with President Truman, is viewing the actions of the Soviet Union at this point in time as a threat to democracy. And what President Truman is wanting is Congress to provide support for the Greeks in their fight against the communists in this effort to, I guess, make sort of push back against what the Soviet Union was doing in the spread of communism.
And it's this concept that's known as containment.
Yeah.
And that's a one of those words that you'll find in the study of what's going on here. And the idea is this, I believe it was called, I'd have to go back, but something like the domino theory, I think is what was happening. And they were basically saying, listen, if the Soviet Union starts moving about and starts getting power and starts, occupying, different countries, even Greece, if Greece is lost to communism, then you're going to see Turkey that's going to go, and then you're going to see another country go. And it's this domino effect that will basically create a problem of communism growing. We see this in World War II, and I think that's why Truman comes up with this, because of what Hitler did, this blitzkrieg of how he just kept marching and marching and marching, and you have the leaders in Great Britain and France basically saying, if we don't stop them, then they'll take over all of Europe. And so, Truman is given the task that he's got to go before the American people. He's in essence, he's got to go before Congress, and he has to share how serious this is, that communism is rapidly approaching, and if it conquers Europe, then it's going to eventually conquer America. And so his advisors go to him and says, "Hey, you got to be Mr. Salty in front of Congress and in front of the American people." And one of his advisors basically said, in order to really stop this, you've got to go out there, and the quote was to quote, scare the hell out of the American people,
Hmm.
to let them really understand that if we don't stop something, then we are in jeopardy of being consumed by it as well. Now, I do think that it's very interesting what Truman says in the Truman Doctrine, because, number one, he is advocating for democracy. He's advocating for there to be the opportunity for countries to make their own decisions and not for other people to make the decisions for them. But Ray, one of the things that I found interesting is in that speech, he doesn't advocate for war. He doesn't advocate for military. He says our goal as American people is to help through economics and financial aid. And so I think that is a key thing, is that he wanted to fight the fight, but he wanted to do it through dollars instead of tanks.
Yeah, and the amount of money, uh, 1947 money was $400 million. That would be very interesting to see how much that would work out to today. I'm sure it would be in the billions.
Absolutely. And so, you're thinking, okay, I'm an American, citizen, and I'm listening to him, and I hear what he's saying, and it does scare them. But you're also now thinking about, well, do I want to spend all of that money for Greece? I mean, we're coming out of a war. We've got to rebuild
Horrible.
America. I mean, it's a huge world war.
Mhm.
There's going to be requests to go and to help parts of Europe that's been destroyed. So all of these things are coming upon Truman. And, while many people are I guess in the positive for what Truman's wanting to do, there are some people who just say, you know what, let Greece be Greece, let Greece deal with their own issues. That's not for us. We're, on the other side of the Atlantic Ocean. So it gets good reviews, but there are some who, don't really think that it's the right thing to do. However, that fear of the Soviet Union looms large over America, and ultimately, that's why the Truman Doctrine, does become policy because it wants to contain the Soviet Union.
Yeah, and earlier you mentioned domino, the domino theory. And that, of course, was what we saw that sort of got the United States involved in Vietnam, was the idea if the domino, if the Soviets, if communism took over one country, Vietnam, for example, then it would spread to another country, and then it would spread to another country. So it's the idea if the domino falls over here, it's just going to click, 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 click to keep falling. And the fear was that the Soviet Union was gaining more and more power and would eventually take over and directly threaten the United States. So the idea was we've got to do, even if it's 400, then going back to, 1947, even if it's $400 million, jumping forward to Vietnam, even if it's troops and money, and we've just got to do whatever we need to do to stop this Soviet Union in its tracks and prevent them from gaining more and more power and influence around the world.
And if you think about it, every war, except for the one that dealt with the axis of evil in 9/11, but
Right.
every war after World War II is really as a result of the Truman Doctrine.
Hmm.
In the idea that it is the role of America to go out and to make sure that any country is protected through the creation of alliances that are directed not against just Soviet Union or today Russia, but directed against any foreign enemy that is trying to overtake a country, which the Truman Doctrine also leads to the creation of NATO,
Yeah.
the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, which receives a lot of attention in the news today because of its quote peacekeeping role that it takes on in world affairs.
Yeah, that was created. This speech that we're talking about was 1947. NATO was 1949. So that did not take long for NATO. And I want to go back because I sort of skipped what Chris, I was sort of guilty of the very thing people who spend a lot of time studying and thinking about the Korean War complain about, and it's sort of the forgotten war. I skipped from World War II straight to Vietnam,
Right.
but you see it with the communist China trying to have influence in Korea, the United States. I believe it was Eisenhower, uh,
Mhm.
troops there, of course, in Korea, and you have the Korean War. And you mentioned just a second ago, I thought it was interesting because it had been something I was thinking about when I was putting my notes together for this. You mentioned the war on terror, following 9/11. And I do see a link between the Truman Doctrine and the war on terror. Because what was the war on terror but an attempt to push back against against what was perceived to be a threat against freedom, what was perceived to be a threat against democracy, and I think jumping back to Woodrow Wilson was in his getting America involved in World War One was make the world safe for democracy. I think you see that as well with George W. Bush following 9/11. That's just my thinking. I don't know if you see it the same way.
Well, no, I agree because, once again, I go back to the Truman Doctrine. If you look at it in one word, it's containment.
Yeah.
And so when you do look at that war on terror, it was containing. It was the containing of nuclear weapons. It was the containing of, these rogue individuals. And so I do believe that the Truman Doctrine is alive and well in today's society because I remember there was a quote by the historian Eric Foner who basically said that it set a precedent
Hmm.
and for anti-communist regimes throughout the world to be prevented from encroaching upon other countries. And so, I look at this. Harry Truman is probably not well known for his presidency, except for the bombings
Mhm.
of Hiroshima and Nagasaki and the Truman Doctrine. You take those two things away, and Harry Truman is a blip on the radar of American presidencies. However, those two things that he did, ending a world war, which was absolutely just a powerful move that he had to make, but also this idea of containment, the Truman Doctrine, which is still ongoing today. So he does have a lasting legacy. And it just goes to show that once you go into that seat of power, one move can truly establish a legacy of American diplomacy or, the legacy of a president for good or for bad. Um, in this situation, it truly was for good because, he had this idea that America has a role to ensure that all countries have the right to freedoms. And for that, he is to be applauded.
And I think you mentioned this earlier in the episode. We see it playing out even today. In fact, ever since the Truman Doctrine was established, I guess you could say, um, we see it in American foreign policy. And even though today the Soviet Union is no more, Russia still is. And we see America still, and not just America, but NATO and NATO nations pushing back against Russian expansion, and
Yeah,
specifically Ukraine.
yeah, Ukraine right there. I mean, we're talking today that there's controversy because of the amount of money that America is giving to Ukraine,
Yeah.
which is a small country, broken off from Russia years ago. It's a small country, so it's like the Greece crisis, and yet you see America giving all of this money for weapons and for things of that nature. And just recently, President Biden gave the okay that Ukraine can use American-made weapons to fire into
Hmm.
the country of Russia, which is something that is a major escalation in political affairs when it comes to the relation between Russia and America. Because, I mean, the idea, I mean, I don't know if we're necessarily in a Cold War part two anymore, like what we had between Russia and the United States. However, there is this kind of we're going to stay in our corner, you stay in your corner kind of approach. Russia basically doesn't really meddle with America. America's not meddling with Russia, except for the fact that we're giving money to a country that is fighting a war against Russia. And, I don't even, maybe I need to think through this, I guess, but I don't even know if the leader of Russia, Vladimir Putin, was that concerned that money was going from America to Ukraine. I mean, he doesn't like it, of course, but I think he was just like, whatever. But when you start seeing the escalation of now using those missiles to go into your own country, well, that ups the ante
Hmm.
because now you're basically saying, okay, it's not just about a land war in Ukraine, but now it's a multifaceted war because you are approaching Russia. So I do wonder, is the firing of weapons into a country, does that go against the Truman Doctrine? And the reason I say that is because the Truman Doctrine is focused on protecting Ukraine and their country, but does it allow you to fire into a country? Does that make sense? You see what I'm saying?
Yeah, yeah, it does. Is it a step beyond just preventing Russian expansion?
Is it a step beyond containment? There you go.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Is it a step beyond containment and now an expansion of
Mm.
something?
Yeah.
And I don't know. We're just talking out loud about those things, but it does relate into current events because you have a president that is outgoing,
Hmm.
who is winding down his term. He is, quote, a lame duck president.
Hmm.
He is salty. You
Hmm.
know, he is very salty for multiple reasons. You have an incoming president who, be what it is, has a probably a better relationship with Russia than the current president has. So you have all of these dynamics that are going in. It's a very important time to study the Truman Doctrine
Hmm.
and to really see what is the role that America plays in world affairs. Because if you look at the outgoing president and the incoming president, they might have two perspectives on that are completely different. And then other countries can play that on America, and you could create another global conflict.
Yeah, you could. It's almost like when I'm looking at some of the things President Biden is doing on his way out, it's almost like, okay, I'm going to force the situation right now. I'm sort of going to take it to its limits right now. I'm going to do what I think I need to do now, because I think he probably looks at Trump, President-elect Trump, as maybe not willing to do some of the stuff he's doing. But of course, you never know what someone's going to do when they get in the Oval Office. You never know.
And containment means different things for different people.
Exactly. Because I think President-elect Trump, if he was to be in this conversation, he would probably assert that, diplomacy, working with Putin would be a type of containment. Am I
I
wrong?
think he said, yeah, I think because I didn't he say I could end this war in like a minute
Yeah,
or something like
yeah,
that. He
yeah,
he said I could get both parties down and sit down at the table and we could talk
yeah.
through and some of that's hyperbole, but also I do think that when we examine the recent presidents, I do think he is the one who probably does have the gusto to be able to bring both parties to sit down at a table. I go back to the beer summit that President Obama had many years ago, but I what we've seen in President Trump's first term is that he doesn't mind going to North Korea and meeting the North Korean guy. He doesn't mind going and sitting down with Putin. Some people say you shouldn't sit down with those type of people, but in diplomacy, I think he says I'm going to sit down with whoever I need to sit down to try to quote contain what is going on. So I do think containment looks different in people's eyes. And, who's right? Well, that's a matter of, everybody's opinion on what Truman was trying to do and what is best, for America during this particular time.
Yeah, and ultimately history will determine who's right. History will be the one that determines which side is right and which side is wrong. But I tell you, you talk about, I know we got to wrap up here, but you talk about Trump and North Korea. I remember when Trump met with Kim Jong-un there at is it the DMZ? Or is that's the website?
No, it's DMZ,
Demilitarized zone.
demilitarized zone.
DMZ, not TMZ. That the DMZ and Trump crossed over into North Korea. I mean, just a few steps. I mean, it was just a few steps. But those were, and I'm not being partisan here. I don't care who people support. But whether you're Democrat or Republican, you got to admit those were historic steps. I mean, he was the first American president to actually step foot in North Korea in quite some time. And it was, you know, I don't know if it was unplanned or staged, I don't know, but it was certainly a historic moment.
And same thing with Nixon when Nixon
Yeah.
reached out to China.
Yeah.
I mean, that was a huge moment. I mean, his Secretary of State Henry Kissinger, who spent many a times, in meeting with China. And so these are things in which you got to do what you got to do to
Mhm.
try to quote save the world is what the Truman Doctrine basically was doing, and how do you do that? You take it one day at a time, and you have good people around you who help you make the right decisions. And so Truman had those right people because they pushed him and they said, you've got to go out there and show people just how serious this is. And truth be known, when after Truman, is succeeded by others, and you get into JFK and you have the Cuban Missile Crisis and you have all of these other things, you see that Truman actually knew what he was talking about.
Mhm. Yep, he was proven right. Well, Chris, another great episode of History You Didn't Know But Should. I hope our listeners, if you enjoyed this episode, will share this episode with your family and friends. Share the podcast with your family and friends, and give us a like on Spotify or any other platform you're listening to us on. Until next time, I'm Ray,
I'm Chris.
and we'll talk to you later.